The terms of curiosity, of learning, and of pleasure are a perfect introduction to the set of ideas that Jonas and I are going to attempt to be in an editorial dialogue in relation to over the next 45 minutes. Thank you again to Natalie for accepting my proposal of turning an invitation for myself to give an opening lecture in which I would run through 5 or 6 years of work that could be considered within the realms of feminist and queer practice and bring forward some of the ongoing dialogues that I've had around that, to rather than repeat that script that I'd been giving now, that would have been the 5th time this month, to bring in an agonist, to bring in a colleague, which would hopefully provoke some of the things within that discourse that often remain unquestioned. So this proposal, in many ways, arises from my own growing senses of concern with the limitations that tend to wrap around the possibilities of discussing feminist questions within the knowledge platforms that we have. So, and this I find functions on both sides. So on the one hand, the knowledge apparatus of the panel and of certain forms of authority that derive from patriarchal organizations. But on the other hand, the limitations that I've been encountering within feminist discourse itself, and particularly strong inhibitions and prohibitions towards addressing the political with the capital P. And when one's addressing political with the capital P, of course, Jonas is an excellent person to go into dialogue with. So I wanted to thank Natalie for taking this on.
Can you actually see the images, or are we sitting like right in front of them? Yeah? Oh, that works.
Lights?
Okay. We're not blocking the images. You can see it. Okay, that's nice. So thank you also for the invitation. First of all, from Vivian, who has introduced my body in this specific symposium, and then for you for accepting that or finding that an exciting challenge. And it is indeed true that for those, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with my work, but in general, I'm asked also to perform or participate in symposiums on state, power, ideology, democracy, activism, revolution, along those lines. And of course that also tends to script and deny or exclude many other engagements that I'm also involved with. So it's great to have this format and Vivian as a partner in crime to explore what that is. Our mutual starting point was the article that you see projected here behind us, a column written by Miranda Devine for the Sydney Telegraph on May 10, 2015. And it is entitled, "Mutant Feminists Are Raping Reality." Vivian posted that image a couple of months ago on her Facebook page, and immediately that image for me was, or this title for me was absolutely striking, especially because one of the comments that came, because there were many comments that followed on Vivian's post, but there was one comment in specific that said, finally, reality was asking for it. And somewhere I felt completely sympathetic with that point of view, which began the quest of both of us of what it is that mutant feminism as a term seems to bring into mind, or why this term is somehow sympathetic but even necessary for us to explore. In the case of the original article by Devine, the starting point was a kiss that was given to Prince William, who was on tour after the birth of his first child, I think. And this image circulated widely, a woman who out of the audience suddenly kissed Prince William without having had like permission for that. And Devine questions what would have happened if this would have been the other way around. What if a man would have suddenly kissed the princess? Aren't we dealing here with double standards? Everyone enjoys this specific image or celebrates it as a kind of image of spontaneity, but isn't there a double standard around the notion of rape? And she kind of deepens that kiss into the realm of false rape accusations by women, etc., and makes a plea for the discrimination or exclusion of men, or the kind of the repressed position of the male when it comes to these types of cases.
But so what does it mean to be struck by a headline? And what kind of a semiotic conjunction is this set of words themselves that arrive to both Jonas and I as sort of containing some kind of truth content, as arriving to us as speaking to some kind of reality that we actually would desperately like to see, in which mutant feminists were wreaking havoc within the reality that exists around us. And so The Happy Separatist is a proposal for a journal. And the form that we would like to bring to this conference is of an editorial dialogue. So to look at this set of words and to edit back and forth through its possible meanings, as well as to question the way in which it's a conjunction of words that seems to also be straining against the boundaries of what is expressible within the set of terms that it can actually perform itself. First edit. So first edit, Happy Separatist.
So in general, when we speak about separatism, or the concept of separatism, is always associated with a negative politics. So one separates because of nationalistic purposes. There's a kind of egotistical dimension to it, how it's understood in the popular realm. It is about not sharing one's benefits within a specific cultural body. The Catalans wants to split. Catalonia wants to split away from Spain. Why? Because they have all the natural resources and they want to benefit from it themselves. The Flemish wants to split from Belgium, similar reasons. So there's always a kind of nationalist and economic beneficial dimension that is expressed around the notion of separatism, and that has given it a very negative quality, or a negative understanding in popular discourse. Now in 2014, I met Natalie McGarry, who's a representative of Women for Independence, and she's currently an MP, political representative for the Scottish National Party. And Natalie McGarry, that you see here, standing in front of a large map of Scotland, came to speak at a conference that I organized in 2014, just one day after the referendum for Scottish independence had taken place. So that was on September 18. 45% of people voted for independence, for separation from the United Kingdom. That was not enough, but still a huge amount. Now, standing there in front of this map, Natalie McGarry explained what the referendum for her had been about, that Women for Independence was a feminist organization that connected the right to choose over one's own body to the right over one's own political autonomy. So she saw a structural relationship between these two. In the case of Scotland, whether under the rule of Blair's Labour Party, the Conservative Party, either of the two, they were dragged and forced into the war on terror, the invasion in Iraq, forced under the implementation of austerity politics upon its population, its loss of natural resources, benefiting Westminster more than anyone. So they explained, Women for Independence, the violence against the female body in a structural relationship with the violence of the UK against the social body of the Scottish independence movement. So the fight for the autonomy over one's own body becomes similar to the fight, or becomes an equivalent to the fight over the social body, and the Scots, very importantly, pledged that if they would gain independence, they would repurpose their natural wealths into developing education, healthcare, cultural programs. And on top of that, what is very interesting about this form of separatism is that whereas the UK, which has been terrorized discourse-wise by the United Kingdom Independence, the UK Independence Party, so-called UKIP, racist discourse that fueled the idea of wanting to separate from the European Union, the Scots actually wanted in the European Union. So their separation, at the same time, is a reintegration into something else. And this, I think, is very important because it shows the emancipatory potential of this term. separatism, in the sense that separation of Scotland from the UK means reintegration into something else. It means also the creation of something else. So the rejection of the powers that govern us, in the case of Scotland, the UK, create the possibility to redefine power in and of itself and the construction of power. So I would say that happy separatism, by definition, is a quest for an emancipatory separatism. The second edit, happy separatism and the matrimonial state.
Thanks. So I'd like to introduce, in response to that, 3 further textual objects, and I think this is something that will recur throughout the talk. It was very interesting as Jonas and I sort of entered into conversation that we have different ways of thinking that we bring to bear, and Jonas as an artist often thinks through images, and I as a critic will bring a lot of words, so thank you for bearing with me. So the first on the left is another citation from Facebook, which was on the eve of the Scottish independence vote, and it was just a commentary that a Dutch curator made, mimicking the voice of Cameron, who says, "You cannot do this. I'll take the credit cards and block the account. I'm taking the kids. I'll have the car. You will have no support, no friends. Your family is going to abandon you. You're stupid. You'll be on benefits. You need to leave the house. We cancel the holiday. I have the pets and take the books and records. Yes, that one too. You'll never find love again. I'll take both the cards. You'll never play, study, or work again. It's going to be painful, dear. This time I will not calm down. No, I will not." Which, again, strikes as, this conjunction of words that kind of strikes with this sense of having a certain truth claim in it as well. That it seems to articulate a script, which is the one that, in fact, writes our lives through our bodies all the time, but is rarely ever articulated as such. So I propose this as the intimate script of the patriarchal matrimonial state, which I'll discuss further. On the top right is a citation from Hegel's Philosophy of Right. It's in fact a section of that text in which he's defining what he calls the modern state, and he's paraphrasing Rousseau. And it gives us effectively the subjective architecture of that matrimonial state as it was established as an integral part of establishing industrial capital modernity in the Middle Ages. So Hegel, the family is a sphere of ethical life dominated by particular and personal altruism, while civil society, on the other hand, is a sphere of universal egoism in which each individual seeks to use others as a means to his or her own ends. So this, as I said, gives the subjective architecture of the script that is sort of being seen to flow out above Cameron's head, or to be being played through within that political conjunction of the Scottish independence vote. The third textual reference is a citation by Silvia Frederici from the book Caliban and the Witch from 2004, in which she is referring to the very specific and material origins of this intimate economic arrangement within processes by which women and their knowledges were expropriated and enclosed in the same drive as the lands of the commons were enclosed from the 1200s to the 1500s. And we can think of, what was the name of the Scottish?
Natalie McGarry.
Of Natalie McGarry's claim to want to retake the natural resources of Scotland, So it's possible to connect that with a desire among women to retake the capacity to have power within society. So Silvia Frederici says, "There is no doubt that in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, women suffered a unique process of social degradation that was fundamental to the accumulation of capital and has remained so ever since." So among these 3 textual objects, we see the construction of the matrimonial state and of the capitalist realist legacy, which I'll discuss further. But 2 questions arise in terms of what is at play within a happy separatist politics here, being why happy and separate from what? So I'll answer the second one first. Separate from what? Well, as Jonas has already introduced to us, the emancipatory potential of a separatist politics arises at the moment that it is not a generalized withdrawal, but at which it attaches itself to other political projects and even other forms of integration. Separatist from what I would say is the capitalist realism of the matrimonial state, which Frederici calls the new sexual deal of the 1400s. Within Caliban and the Witch, in very detailed, almost forensic way, she outlines the way in which the municipalities of France, of the city-states such as Venice, and effectively most local government forms throughout Western Europe, sanctioned sexual violence against proletarian women in an effort to break the solidarity of the peasant class that had formed throughout the peasant uprisings of the 1300s and in what was called the golden age of the medieval proletariat following the plague, after which the sheer loss of life had temporarily tipped the balance of power into the hands of labor power rather than the merchant and landowning classes. Frederici also outlines the way in which this new sexual deal, in which violence against women within the domestic sphere is permitted, effectively condoned by the state, paved the way for the mass demonization of rebellious women through the witch hunts and the persecution of female behavior that may amount to what Marx called a strike against the making of children. And Marx thought that it wasn't possible to have a strike against the making of children, but what Frederici shows very acutely is the forms of violence and degradation that in fact are the strike breakers of the sphere of female power. So we see that the reality that we inhabit is not just any reality, it's the reality that's born of historical processes, and it's a reality that is the matrimonial state, I'm going to say this 1,000 times, of the capitalist realist society, which is a citation of Mark Fisher, the UK theorist, who proposes to us that capitalist realism is the condition in which it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capital. If you look at cinema, I think that's quite, bears out very strongly. So we can see also that this political and economic order is based upon a history of sexual violence, among which is rape, and that has enacted the degradation of women specifically, as well as the feminized realm of the intimate knowledges of the family in general, as that which is without formal political power. So the second question is, regarding happy separatism, why happy? Given that I've now outlined a very bleak picture. So for me, it's very interesting to be in dialogue regarding the question of separatism with Jonas, who brings very different knowledges and experiences to bear upon that political form. As Jonas has outlined, he has a very deep and specialist research into macro-political separatist movements who seek to gain recognition as territorialized entities that would meet the state in some ways at its physical borders, at its external borders. My own knowledge and experience of separatism comes from a personal engagement with feminist and queer political movements that are confronting the state within its internal policing of the recognition of its own citizenry. These movements confront the state's adjudication of its own subjects, of its ethico-juridical policing of those subjects that it cannot accept within its political body, that must be disciplined or abandoned as a kind of a human waste to the body politic. Within these communities, queer and feminist movements, separatism has an extremely negative connotation and is considered to be, in fact, a very retrograde and exclusionary political position. There's very few people within a radical queer movement that I think, bring on board to a separatist project without a lot of convincing and a lot of dialogue. And there's good reason for the skepticism towards that separatism within these communities. It's learned from a bitter experience with some of the most divisive tendencies of separatism in practice, the classical example being the refusal of trans women from separatist feminist spaces, such as the Michigan Women's Festival And a feminist such as Germaine Greer, my own countrywoman, is a major perpetrator in this regard, effectively colonizing the category of woman and overdetermining it to an identitarian condition. So Spivak has an excellent analysis of the way that this politics functions within her writing on strategic essentialism. She calls this regressive form of separatism a clinging to marginality. So it's one in which, particularly classically, say like a white middle-class woman will say, well, I'm a feminist and I am woman and I'm defining all of the terms of what that means. And it's also a clinging to marginality in that it promotes a politics that is a race to the bottom within a moral politics of exemplary suffering. Here, the one with the greatest political claim is the one with the greatest experience of suffering and injustice. And so it produces a kind of a negatively defined political authority. And we can see how this is a very unhappy separatism. I would argue that it's one that mirrors the governing structure of the realm of politics proper as Hegel gives it to us, wherein to have a political claim one needs to represent only a single position. Why would separatism perpetuate this politics? Why would separatism not be interested in separating from this whole conjunction? The happy separatist is happy because she has learned her feminist lessons well. She knows to locate her politics from the sphere of the particular and the altruistic when making claims towards politics proper. And we see that, of course, what Cameron is showing us is a very unhappy and coercive dependency. However, the happy separatist knows that there is no self-determination that is not also one of codependency and relational obligation. Simply, it's not the dependency that one is scripted with, that these words, what I call the script of the matrimonial state, is trying to assimilate one into. Third edit, the uncanny muse.
Yeah, what I feel is very important about this description of, let's say, the substructure of Cameron's actual discourse. Like the difficulty of the Scottish independence vote was also that in the general media it's kind of portrayed or framed as a formal question of independence or not. And the UK can, in a way, Cameron can hide behind the fact we allowed this referendum to take place, the people can choose. But not without this kind of permanent intimidation of a whole variety of different father figures that pop up until like Obama and François Hollande, who even on the evening of the vote for independence, when people were still voting, warned once more on international television, if you separate from us, we will take, and it's exactly what you described, we will take your money. So there's also a really intimate dialogue that takes place underneath what is presented as a kind of formal political question. So this conference is entitled Muse, Powerful Totem or Harmless Object, question mark. And I thought about this term, muse, and if I've ever used it myself. And the only example that I could think of was this article that was published August 3, 2007 in a Dutch NRC Handelsblad newspaper. And it reads, in English, it would read more or less as following: Artist, Wilders, my muse. And for those who are not familiar with Dutch politics, Wilders here refers to the politician Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the ultranationalist party, ultranationalist Freedom Party, the PVV, and the word artist in this case refers to me, because I'm the artist in question. So this article came as a result of a court case that took place as a result of a series of artworks that I made many years ago, in which I included photos of the politician Geert Wilders, and he interpreted this artwork as a threat of his life. And as a result, he prosecuted me for threatening a politician with death. So in 2007, the first trial took place, because there were many subsequent ones, and one of the first questions that the judge asked me was, do you hate Geert Wilders? Like, is that the reason why you put photos of him in your artwork? And I said no. I said, Wilders is first and foremost my muse. And there were many journalists that were present at the trial at that moment, and they took this immediately as the quote for the headline of the next day. And I think the reason for that is that that has everything to do with the curious use of the term muse in this specific context. On one hand, it reinserts my position in the trial as an actual artist, because I was sitting there and the question was, did you consciously threaten Wilders? Like, did you consciously perform the criminal act? But by referring to him as my muse, I reinserted myself as an artist and him as my source of inspiration. But at the same time, the term muse is also uncomfortable, first of all because Geert Wilders is a man, and so am I, and in popular conception, the term muse always refers to the female figure. And the other side of it is that there's this aspect of intimacy that is implied when I call Wilders my muse. Whereas Wilders is an ultranationalist and I'm a leftist artist, so we're supposed to not have that type of intimacy. It's uncomfortable, it's uncanny. So, because he is my inspiration, this intimate, this personal dimension enters into the relationship, a personal dimension that Wilders rejects. He rejects my intimacy, he wants me in jail. But I reinsert it by calling him my muse. So I emphasize that this intimacy is there in some form. And one of the journalists present at the trial wrote down this conversation, and he concluded in this article from my answer to the judge, and I quote him, "With this trial, Geert Wilders, is far from liberated from Staal." I thought this was also interesting, it was about liberation. "With this trial, Wilders is far from liberated from Staal. The artist even called the politician his muse." So the journalist interprets this notion of muse almost as something of a violation. Like there's this uncanny obsession that he's able to depict, that he's able to interpret. And then, being in conversation with Vivian and today being in this panel, I wondered if that same uncanny feeling would have been experienced if Geert Wilders was not a man but was a woman. So on one hand, most probably in this room, if I would have called the woman Geert Wilders my muse, that would probably have rightfully been seen as sexist, subjectifying the political representative in question. But at the same time, in popular conception, it would have reinforced the normative understanding of what is supposed to be a muse. So actually things fall rightfully back into the place as they should be. Because the muse is the one that's being observed and translated by me as an artist, as a male artist, into a form of cultural capital. That is the artwork. The muse poses and I create. So declaring Wilders my muse, I see now, in retrospect, was maybe a possible necessary mutation away from the oppressive conception that the term muse signifies and that this journalist made visible through this article. Fourth edit, the uncanny muse, it's a knowledge problem, stupid.
Listening to you speak, I realized that this talk could very well, in fact, be called The Curious Muse, Vernacular Truth and Mutant Politics, which is something that came up. But so, Jonas raises the question of what relations we enact when someone is claimed as a muse, and the way in which it immediately imposes an asymmetrical relation of authorship and intimacy. So a certain exchange is possible between the muse and the artist. However, the muse is configured, enclosed within the realm of intimate knowledge, while the artist authors this as art, is attributed a name, recognition, public acclaim, certain amount of public power on account of this. So when a young leftist male artist claims a far-right politician as his muse, we see that something queer happens because of the gender reversal. The appropriate scripts of authority fail. It makes national news headlines. As Jonas has indicated already, the problem of the muse is an epistemological problem. It concerns how we know what we know, or as I've titled this section, it's a knowledge problem, stupid. This is why when Jonas asked me if there was anyone that I may have a relation to as a muse or in some ways similar to his relation to Wilders, I had to think of Princess Sierra. She's so amazing. I really love her. So Princess Sierra is, according to her own description, the original financial dominatrix. She practices a form of BDSM organized around the principle of erotic submission through economic intimate domination. The financial dominatrix is the ultimate incarnation of Lyotard's libidinal economist. Her practice is a meticulous attention and affective labor that amplifies and unleashes the erotic charge that is latent with each and every act of financial exchange. So the text that is behind this image, which is her sort of website image, is an account by one of her subjects who calls himself Sir Wankalot, in which he details his experience of becoming sort of enmeshed within her liberatory script of financial eroticism. And it details the way in which she's very, very carefully watching her bank account. And as deposits come into her bank account, she is texting or emailing the people who've sent them in order to sort of amplify the affective experience that they have of what that exchange is. And the way in which it is configured, not just as a movement of economic quantities, but as a transaction which has libidinal investments and which is coded through desire. Ziherl lists herself as a mastermind, having, she said, implanted the possibility of financial climax in the minds of thousands of men via her website. She says, "You will pay for my happiness in every way possible, and you will learn to love it." As a happy separatist, I uphold that Princess Ziherl has the genius that we need within this current moment of crisis, only that we have no authorial form to accredit and encrypt this knowledge that she brings to us and that she has developed through her practice of intimate research. The knowledge that she brings is of the shift that has occurred within the scripts of the matrimonial state from industrial modernity to the post-Fordist era that we are in of the knowledge economy. What Princess Ziherl is telling us is the way in which we are no longer just governed by the biopolitics of the state, but by the privatized bondage of the debt society. What Ziherl knows is the way in which the current political subject is no longer bound by fidelity to a political leader. So one no longer acts politically towards a monarch or towards a head of state, but acts politically out of fear of exposure to debt risk, out of the fear of defaulting on a mortgage or of losing employment. And this is part of why Cameron is such a chump in the former slide. No one is voting for him. They merely vote against the risk of their exposure to financial disciplining. One votes at this point for a political leader, and what one receives in return is an interest rate. Ziherl knows this. And more than that, through practice, she knows how this organizes people to behave, to be obedient, and she can wield people to experience pleasure in the relinquishing of financial power. To me, Princess Ziherl performs a work that is similar to the function in which a hacker is able to reveal the code that underpins the smooth skin of a web page. Through her accounts and through the extraordinary textual confessions that she has her clients to provide to us, we find that she reveals the script of capitalist realism and the matrimonial state that we are compelled to run through our lives as it exists at this point in history. As a happy separatist, I say that Dijsselbloem and his MA in economics has nothing to offer on the sheer use value of the knowledge that Princess Ziherl possesses, until we have a way to accredit her knowledge, and indeed until we can muster the willingness to address ourselves to Princess Ziherl as a learned master of the new intimate debt society that Deleuze in 1992 called the control society. We will remain in bondage to the extraordinary illogics of economic rationalist austerity and the very unhappy matrimonial statehood that we are in. Fifth edit, muse to author.
I have to say that maybe now I'm finally understanding the case study of Princess Ziherl has for me been one of the most difficult to process, because for me there's something about the fact that people already have, I mean, that people get a kick out of donating excessive amount of money, first of all, makes me incredibly aggressive towards the fact that someone has that kind of money, and I would rather take that money away and put it like into a labor camp and develop some proper working ethics or something. But I understand now better from what you're saying that, in a way, what she proposes is like the ultimate counterpoint of what you refer to as voting for an interest rate. Like voting for an interest rate, giving a sense of agency, the act of voting for a figure like Cameron, then only getting a kind of speculative economic reality in return, in which we are always slaves to our own debt. And in that sense, there's a kind of liberation in handing one's over to the master, Sharan, without even thinking that, I mean, that gives us agency in a completely reversed sense. Anyway, the fifth edit. This goes back to an anecdote from the period that I was myself still in art school, and in art school there's always the kind of recurring question, is there any artist in your life that you would ever like to meet, like for real, physically? And for me there was always only one, very logically, and that was Louise Bourgeois, the artist Louise Bourgeois. And somehow that came as a natural response, because it was the only artist that I felt on an intimate level, not just in appreciating the work, but on an intimate level, there would actually be the possibility of a conversation without me having to think what that conversation would be, but as something that would somehow naturally come into being. When I was studying in Boston, still an art student, my studio was always stacked with books of Louise Bourgeois, and one night a fellow student came to me, gave me a paper, and it was the paper with her phone number. I called her, she answered, and she invited me to what was called her Sunday salons. So in private, without making this public, up to 5 people, makers, whatever kind of makers, were welcomed at her house on Sundays, with the only rule that you would have to present what you do. So at the time I came, there was a shrink, a curator, 2 artists, and a cook. And everyone presented what they did, first to Louise and then to the rest of the group. So she created this kind of intimate space of exchange surrounding people that felt connected to her work. So the next night, after calling her, I fought my way through a snowstorm from Boston, between Boston and New York, because that was like exactly the yearly moment that all hell broke, natural hell broke loose, to meet her on time. For me, the works that were always most important were the series Femme Maison, of which you see an image here behind me, depicting a mansion, most probably referring to the house of her own youth, the house of birth of Louise Bourgeois herself. And what it shows is an architecture of domestication as much as an architecture of memory, of her personal memory, the space where Bourgeois was humiliated by her father and betrayed through the several mistresses that her father upheld while her mother was on a sickbed. So one could say that this is the negative mutation of the feminine, capsulated, domesticated by the male paternal figure, whom Bourgeois would later get rid of famously in her installation, Destruction of the Father. I hope you have an image in mind, a large installation in which the father, her father who used to be king at the dinner table at her house, is shown eaten, consumed by his children. The 1982 portrait of Bourgeois by Robert Mapplethorpe could be seen as the exact counterpoint of this previous image, as the counterpoint of the Femme Maison. Under her arm, Bourgeois is holding a fillet, a sculpture in the form of a large penis. Important to note that this is a work that she worked on from 1968 until 1999. So this was a sculpture that has been continuously under her care. I think that's really important. So the symbol of male potency that ruled her architecture of memory, as you could see in the previous image, is now detached from the body, domesticated. Her father has been consumed by his children, only his penis remains. What I think is important about the photo is that Bourgeois holds fillet very neatly under her arm, almost as a kind of baguette, smiling, not vengeful. Like her posture towards the penis is not an aggressive one, rather confident. So confident that she doesn't even have to hold it in front of her, pretending that it would be her penis to kind of own the power of the father. She can just very casually, she holds it to her side. So for me, through her work, Bourgeois, what she did is confront and alter the symbols that governed her in this personal, intimate sphere of the household. And these two images show that process. And they never disappeared. I mean, she never pretended that the father figure in the form of this dismembered penis was no longer there. It was still there, but it changed in the way that it used to control her. And as such, for me, Mapplethorpe's image is, by definition, an image of liberation. So, me as a student, to come back to that, I arrived in New York on time. I had a box of black chocolates with me. That was an order of Bourgeois on the phone. She said, you can meet me on Sunday this time, bring black chocolates. She hung up. I arrived in this house with immensely high ceilings, covered with drawings and notes from all of her work. She was sitting behind her desk, and it was very difficult not to see that image as very close to, maybe you know the sculpture series Maman, these large spider sculptures that Bourgeois made at the end of her life. And there was that sense of a spider in her ideal web, in this ideal space that she constructed for herself. Looked through my drawings with approval, and we spoke exactly as I imagined. At the time I was mainly making drawings, very much inspired by her work, so it felt as a very intimate exchange between different architectures of memory, mine as a student and her as a much older artist. I think of her now, and I thought of her now in the context of this symposium, because never would I have thought or even dared to call Louise Bourgeois a muse. Louise Bourgeois, for me, is an author, and she re-authored the terror of the domestic reality that was enforced upon her. That is the enormous heritage that we take from her work. And that shift from muse to author, for me, is exactly what mutant feminism is all about. Sixth edit, the emancipated penis.
So, in response to Fillet and Bourgeois, there was one particular image that came to mind and that I couldn't get out of my mind. And in considering it for a while, I came to have some interesting reflections upon what is actually at stake within the mutancy of mutant feminism. And so I hope I don't traumatize too many people. It'll get covered up quickly. But what immediately came to mind was this fantastic website, Your Dick Looks Great in Those Heels. As the immediate image that sort of comes after Bourgeois with Fillet. So this is, I mean, it was one of those images that, like the title of this newspaper, sort of had struck me, and then I needed to step back and think, like, okay, why do I have this response to this image? Why do I have that response to that text? Upon reflection, what I think is so compelling for me in this image is, and it's sort of a Tumblr website that just scrolls down sort of like ad infinitum with these men that have submitted these images that they've given captions to, and the captions are fantastic. It's sort of like everything from like the king is dead, which is sort of obvious, like not so emancipated if you say the king is dead, you know, obviously, to like I used a gift card, which I'd say very emancipated, you know. But the phallus here has escaped its overdetermination as an icon of aggressive power. And that's very significant. I mean, when looking at these pages, we should keep in mind the unsolicited confrontation that women attempting to use dating websites only too frequently face when men desire to impose their phallus frontally into the conversation. This happens all the time. And there are other Tumblr feeds dedicated to women that have taken screenshots of those images. So these are not far-fetched reflections. So the phallus here is not an icon of power. It's a perfectly quotidian and pleasant presence, and it's just another accessory. And I find that term accessory very interesting in thinking of like the accessory to a crime. So one whose agency is not present through an action, but somehow by complicity or by being simply present. In sort of understanding what's going on in these images, of course, we understand that in the classic Freudian term, the high heel is a phallic stand-in. So a classical Freudian position on perversion argues that sexual desire strays from the normal because of fear of castration. So the fear of the woman not to have power, not to have the phallus. And that the woman with the fetish object, the whip or the high heels, symbolizes potent castration, being castrated because she's female, but of having a potent phallic symbol, which is the whip or the high heels or so on. So what is actually happening in this image is that we have something akin to a classic image of what the mutant is. So that which is not morphologically different, but is indicating a morphological excess. So Agent Orange affected monkeys with 2 heads, a person with 6 fingers, a giraffe with 5 legs. These are all the images that are immediately returned from a Google image search under the category of mutant. So this mutant morphology of redundancy produces a being that cannot really be considered wholly different from the original. I mean, it's still a snake, it's got an extra head, but I mean, it still has to be a snake. But one that calls into question what exactly defines the original itself. A second head places pressure upon the integrity and functional definition of the original head. This type of mutant cannot be assimilated as a specimen of its type. In being what it is, it opens up ontological questions as to why not. So as a happy separatist, and from my own experience, I would also argue very much that feminism, as it's practiced in public discourse, it's that moment of the lecture, is it? We've got I can go back if you want the earlier shots. As if you didn't get a good look at them. From my own experience as well, I would argue that feminism, as it's practiced in public discourse and within contemporary art, is absolutely in need of such a mutant turn. I'll give you an example. I edited an anthology of materials from the Australian Feminist Art History Archive that were entirely out of circulation, that was from a feminist magazine called Lip. This feminist magazine ran from 1976 to 1982. Yeah, we're running drastically over time, but we're also short because we haven't had something. Okay, I'm going to cut this very short. The point being that one of the things that has arisen through the feminist claims of the 1970s that the personal is political was a claim and a desire to transgress the private economic realm and the public economic realm. However, this occurred at exactly the same time that the neoliberal turn was also desiring and placing pressure upon society for just such a compression of the private and the public sphere. So feminism must question what this similarity or what this sort of doppelganger effect is and what it would be to mutate from that. Yeah, I think that's a good shortening. So the 7th edit, and this is the last edit, mutancy, militancy, empathy.
We are exactly on 45 minutes, actually. Is it still okay?
It's okay.
Yeah? Are you bearing with us? Okay.
We ran a bit late because of the technical issues, but we'll catch up here, I'm sure.
So, the headline that has been returning throughout this editorial meeting, mutant feminists are raping reality, could have very easily applied to a movement that I am personally very involved with, which is the Kurdish women's movement. The Kurdish women's movement came into being as part of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, a Marxist-Leninist organization that was founded in 1978 to wage armed struggle against the Turkish state with the goal to create an own independent Kurdish nation state in response to the ongoing repression of its Kurdish population. Amongst the founders of the PKK were prominent women. Here you see Sakina Jansiz standing next to co-founder Abdullah Öcalan. Öcalan has become the kind of main figure or main symbol of the leadership of the movement, but it's important to remember that Jansiz was there from the very start as well. Murdered in Paris, January 9, 2013, also something very important to remember. So according to Jansiz, the PKK, and I quote her, had been giving an ideological struggle from the very beginning against denial, social, chauvinistic impression, primitive and nationalist approaches, end of quote. And for Jansiz, in the context of the women's struggle of the PKK, she referred to this as the necessary component of the struggle was what she called revolutionary violence, which she explains as a necessary defense to reassert the rights of the Kurds in what the PKK analyzed or described as the interstate colony of Kurdistan. As most of you will probably know, Kurdistan is spread out through 4 different states: Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. The role of prominent women like Janssens in the leadership also translated directly to the way that the guerrilla forces organized themselves in the form of women militia that fought the Turkish army mainly from the southeastern part of the country. This is like the mountainous area that separates Turkey from Syria. In an article by Dilar Dirik, a representative of the Kurdish women's movement, academic, entitled "The Representation of Kurdish Women in the Media," she recalls how Turkish media initially, and still, describe these women fighters, the appearance of this women militia. And I quote her, as, these are headlines, "evil terrorist prostitutes" and "family-hating, brainwashed sex toys of the male fighters." Just to kind of bring back the ongoing headline in mind that we started this conversation with. Western media, on the other hand, this is also interesting, would explain the reason for women to join the PKK in terms of them being oppressed victims, looking for an escape from a backward culture, otherwise facing a life full of honor killings, child marriage, and so on. But even if the latter was the case, like let's say that indeed because of feudal conditions, Kurdish women would join an armed movement, so to fight for to insert their rights within a revolution, this is obviously not an escape. Like, it's not an escape from your culture, it is actually a way of confronting it and altering it. So what is important in both cases, the Turkish description, Turkish media description, and international media description, is that these headlines are meant to discredit authorship. They are meant to discredit authorship of the women's movement over their own revolution. Because they're either brainwashed or they're haunted by child marriage, honor killings. They are mutants. They act outside of their will. They don't have an actual own agency. And internally, the Kurdish women's movement was dealing with a very similar prejudice. When the PKK grew into a mass movement, many men from rural areas joined, and the role of women who had been part of the ranks from the start became compromised, and many male fighters called upon them to return to their original role in the household. And that brought another representative of the movement, Rojda Yildirim, to conclude that the PKK didn't just have an enemy outside in the form of the Turkish state, but also one inside, which she identified as the problem of patriarchy, the enemy of patriarchy. So as a result of that, the Kurdish women's movement over the course of years decided to organize itself autonomously from the PKK. So they worked in alliance, but they developed their own independent organizational structures to analyze also the problems internal to the party, the problem of patriarchy internal to the party, and the way that the external goal was argued as the goal of declaring an independent nation state. So they began to analyze the construct of the nation state as a replication of the internal denial of the role of women. Their labor could not but serve male fighters, and as such went unrecognized as a contribution to the new revolutionary society that they were trying to co-offer. How could a new Kurdish nation state become a classless society? That's what the Marxist-Leninists stated they wanted to realize, when the first colonized class of history, women, were not acknowledged in its creation. So patriarchy, the nation state, capitalism, in the eyes of the Kurdish women's movement, or this is what they concluded, exists in a structural, beneficial relationship one to another. And colonized classes, women in front, are kept systemically outside of the reality that they are trying to create, what they benefit from. Oh, sorry. So since 2012, the Kurdish women's movement took the lead in a next front, not in Turkey, but in the northern part of Syria, which is also known as Rojava, where the Kurds are currently fighting the Assad regime as well as the Islamic State. But this time, what is really fundamental is that the Kurdish women's movement was part of constituting this new autonomous space entity from the start. This is a map that I made together with Dilar Dirik in an attempt for her to explain how this new autonomous area where the Kurdish women's movement is active is operating. And the flag you see is the flag of the Kurdish communities of women. The most important part was that when writing the new constitution, what they call the social contract of this new autonomous region in northern Syria, women were there, the women's movement was there from the start to inscribe a set of demands, a set of institutional and legal demands. They established that all political institutions have a man and a woman as political representatives and cannot operate if they do not have a co-presidency. They forced 40% women participation in all political life, and it means that meetings could not take place if there was not if that quota was not met. They established women's academies such as this academy, Star Academy in Rimmeland, that I photographed when I was doing field work on location, where they invest in genealogy, what can be translated as science of women, a science developed from the perspective of women in colonized stateless classes. And they decided that this new autonomous region that you saw depicted on this complex map would reject the nation-state project in total. And in order to secure their place in the revolution, all women are armed, potentially at least. Here you see a photo of the YPJ, the Women's Defense Forces. These are the autonomous armed militia of the Kurdish women's movement. But in essence, all communities can learn, all women communities, through their own independent organizations, can have the right to access their own weapons on a day-to-day, to have a capacity for day-to-day self-protection. I want to end with this specific image that for me was really striking, that comes directly from the region that the Kurdish women's movement is currently building and governing, self-governing. What you can see here are two images that are offered by the Kurdish women's movement in the public space. What is important to conclude from it is that women with arms, as you can see in the images in the middle, are not a goal in and of itself. They are just a necessary means to co-offer or re-offer reality. Next to the images of the armed woman, you see a hand holding earth, and from this earth a plant emerges. And I think what is crucial about these two images is that they exist in a dialectic relationship to one another. They try to co-create or co-establish a new social ecology, meaning a new ecology of power, a new way that power itself is constructed as practice and practiced. To co-offer a new reality, that is what we have in the hand, goes hand in hand with defending that reality. So for me, what I take from these images is that in some way they are the same. It is not a separation between the fighter and the one who cares. It is a proposition of a new social ecology of a society in which both can be recognized as militant images. For me, both are militant images. It's not mutant feminism that rapes reality, it's mutant feminism that liberates reality from itself. Oh.
It's okay, it's fine. I'm very happy to continue on this case that Jonas brings us of the Kurdish women's movement, as it's one, to me, that asks a number of very profound questions regarding what it means to really, honestly, engage in a feminist project. So to seriously consider what one would be taking on if one really took on the task of overthrowing and having done with patriarchy and the matrimonial state. In a way, my question to Jonas and to those who are very familiar with the Kurdish women's movement is whether the lesson that we take from it is that to overthrow patriarchy, to re-author reality, must women pick up weapons? Is there any way to move through that process without, in fact, adopting phallic power? It's something that I genuinely wonder about, and it's something that concerns me, in that I take it as a very serious possibility, a very serious insight. However, what Princess Ziherl has shown us is that we've entered into a new phase, also in the history of capitalism, wherein we are governed not only according to biopolitics, but through the financialized abstractions of subjectivities, so in which our bodies are encoded as protease inhibitors, for example, and our personalities are abstracted into marketing categories. As a psychiatrist, Adam Phillips has noted recently, I know, 5 minutes, this is the last. So, as psychiatrist Adam Phillips has noted recently, within his psychoanalytic practice, he notes that patients at this point more frequently express shame and traumatic attachment towards their economic affairs than towards their sexual behavior. So this indicates exactly that transition from the biopolitical order of a society organized towards certain forms of life and to a society of control, organized towards profitability and risk aversion. So in this way, the relation of shame is not organized around sexual deviance, so not behaving according to reproductive norms, but around economic deviance, not behaving according to the norm of self-willed upwards mobility and limitless growth. Regarding a society of control, Deleuze makes a particularly memorable prognosis when he writes, "There is no need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons. Fear and hope are functioning exactly within the realm of the script. New weapons is what we need." Within a recent feminist conference, the scholar and activist Nina Power advanced the notion of militant empathy as exactly such a weaponized mobilization amid present mutant feminist needs. And I'll read the citation that she sent by email. "Militant empathy is the attempt to weaponize the feelings of injustice we feel when people are asymmetrically treated and affected by the state, by life, including economic life. It is an attempt to think through a politics that would understand that to feel injustice is something that affects a collective body. Militant because oppositional, empathic because facing with honesty the damage done by the world." What Nina Power proposes is a kind of a power in feeling, a weaponization of the knowledges of the intimate sphere. The term that makes these feelings politically functional, as opposed to privately experienced, is orientation. That they may be directed into forms of alliance in horizontal trajectories that exceed the vertical band of patriarchal inheritance that organizes the family property relation. The act of militant empathy knows the limitations of power organized according to the phallic model of free will, of a singular self pursuing her own needs. In this way, the act of militant empathy is necessarily the act of a mutant political subject, one constituted in conflict with the bounds of politics proper. The nature of the mutancy is of being affectable. As Jonas said before, the mutant within the media coverage of the Kurdish Women's Party is a denigrating term because it indicates that one is acting outside of her own will. So one mutates not by force of will, but through exposure to environmental influence, and in conjunction with a mutagen or an agent of mutation. So militant empathy and mutant feminism is a practice of making affectable, of self-exposure, of feeling powerful in feeling power, including in its negative experience. As such, mutant feminism is a project not of free will, but of willful openness to intimate knowledge and of political codependence. It is a project not of independence, but of emancipatory codependence. So to be self-determined is to know that one is always dependent and to choose one's dependency. It's a collective reauthoring of the social scripts of the debt contract that secure and write our bodies through the lives of the patriarch capitalist real. Thank you.